Hi, this is Daniel Tekanoff. In this video, we're going to cover the history of why the Constitutional Convention requires many more representatives than for ordinary legislation. The ratio of representation is basically the number of citizens represented by each delegate to a constitutional convention, or the number of citizens represented by each representative in the House of Representatives. It is the population divided by the number of delegates or representatives. And in the state ratification conventions that approved the U.S. Constitution after the Constitutional Convention, the average ratio of representation was 1,823, which is 16 times more than the figure of 30,000 set forth in the Constitution itself for representation in the House of Representatives. The recommended ratio of representation for the House of Representatives set forth in the Constitution itself is 1 representative per 30,000 people. The language is set forth right at the beginning of the Constitution in Article 1, Section 2, Paragraph 3. This is a floor. You can't have less than 30,000 people per representative for the House. However, Article 5 has no such floor. You can have many more delegates for a constitutional convention. This will help to ensure true and meaningful representation for all citizens. Here are the numbers of delegates going to the state ratification conventions from 1787 through 1791. The population of the country was estimated at 3 million at that time. We're using that total number for the population. You divide that by the total number of state delegates, which I've calculated to be 1,646. That mostly comes out of Eliot's debates. We get an average ratio of representation for the state ratification conventions that approved the United States Constitution of 1,823. Taking the rule of representation in Article 1, 30,000, dividing that by 1,823, and we see that the men who wrote and approved the U.S. Constitution and the citizens who were able to vote at that time, they considered that when you go to a convention dealing with constitutional amendments, you need 16 times more representatives per the population for it to be appropriate. We call that number a representation multiplier. So we take today's ratio of representation in the House of Representatives, 761,000, we divide it by 16, and that gives us a number just a little bit above 47,500. That would be an adjustment that you would make with today's numbers going into convention. You would need to have each Article 5 delegate at the convention for proposing amendments representing about 47,500 people. But that's not the end of the story. I'm now going to tell you the story of the Dormant Commerce Clause and how that relates to what we're talking about. In the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 3, the U.S. Constitution gives Congress the power to regulate commerce with foreign nations and among the several states. Originally, the Commerce Clause was interpreted to limit the United States government to matters that went across state lines. And there was a relatively clear legal rule that commercial activity that took place within state boundaries was not subject to federal legislation or regulation. Then what happened is there was a lot of pressure for a social safety net and other things, and as a result of that, in the latter half of the 1930s and early part of the 1940s, the Supreme Court completely changed the traditional interpretation of the Commerce Clause. And now, interstate commerce includes anything that may affect commerce in other states, even if all activity is within state borders. This drastically expanded federal power into local matters. The Dormant Commerce Clause acts as a type of broken promise of the framers of the Constitution. Here in Federalist number 10, James Madison talks about if you have too many voters per representative, they don't know local circumstances enough, but if you have, basically he's calling it too many representatives, that means you'd have too many common people and they would be too little fit to comprehend great and national objects. This last part is sort of a dig against the working class. Let's keep going. So the prior passage leads into this one. This is the point that Madison is making, that the federal constitution forms a happy combination, that great and aggregate interests are referred to the national legislature and local and particular to the state legislatures. But since the Constitution was opened up into local and particular interests through the Dormant Commerce Clause, that would indicate that there should have been a tremendous increase in the number of representatives in the national government. And we're going to see the same point being made over and over. Here's James Wilson. He was one of the main delegates at the Constitutional Convention in 1787. He's one of the main drivers of approving the Constitution at the Pennsylvania State Ratification Convention. This is just 8 days after Federalist number 10 was published. James Wilson probably just read it, and he's making this argument to the delegates in the Pennsylvania Convention. Same point he's making, that a large number is not so necessary as in the cases of the state legislatures, and he's acknowledging that when you deal with local interests, you should have representation down to every county, town, and district. And the point being made is, if you now look at the Dormant Commerce Clause and its effect, there should have been a drastic increase of representation in the federal system to account it reaching its finger into local interests. Now we're going to advance about 7 months to the New York State Ratification Convention. That was sort of a battle between Alexander Hamilton and a delegate named Melancton Smith. Melancton Smith had wanted to reduce the ratio of representation set forth in Article 1 from 30,000 to 20,000. Here he's saying to the other delegates that he's not claiming that the wealthy are without virtue or morals. He's only saying that they cannot feel sympathetically with the rest of the people, and so therefore you must have more representatives. In response, Alexander Hamilton makes the same argument that Madison made in Federalist number 10 and that James Wilson made at the Pennsylvania Convention. He's saying, let us consider the powers of the national government and compare them with those of the state legislation. The powers of the new government are general, calculated to embrace the aggregate interest of the Union and the general interest of the state, while the object of the state governments is to provide for internal interest unconnected with the entire Union. That's the argument Hamilton is making here. And he's again making this point that a particular knowledge of the local circumstances of any state is unnecessary for the federal representative. Well, at that time it may have been true, but once the Dormant Commerce Clause basically came into being with the reinterpretation of the Commerce Clause by the Supreme Court, this is no longer true. Now the federal representative has power over every local circumstance, it seems like. And so according to these original arguments made by the framers of the Constitution, there should be much more representatives in the federal system. The conclusion we draw is that the Dormant Commerce Clause violated the promise that the federal government would be limited to general matters. Once the federal government went into local matters through expanding power through the Dormant Commerce Clause, there should have been a much more robust representation built into the national system. This leads us to calculating another representation multiplier to account for the Dormant Commerce Clause expanding federal power into local interests. So using the 2010 census numbers, we had 710,000 people per representative at that time. and all of the state legislators in the houses of representatives in the states, or they also are called assemblies, uh, total 5,459. You use that number to get your average ratio of representation in the states, which is 56,557. So you take the 710,000 ratio of representation in the national government, you divide that by your average ratio of representation in the state governments, which is 56,557, and that gives you a representation multiplier of 12.55. In other words, when you go into local interest, there should be approximately 12 and a half more representatives per the population. So we now go back to our earlier number of 47,563, and we use the multiplier of 12.5, and we get a new ratio of representation of 3,805 for the Article 5 Convention of the People, taking into account both the fact that this is the fundamental constitutional law and you need a much more robust representation, many more representatives in the process for it to be respected by the people, and the fact that the U.S. Legal system now basically creeps into local matters. There should also be more representatives in the national system to account for that as well. For further study, I invite you to take a look at my book, Guide to the First Article 5 Convention of the People.